So today we're going to talk about supply chain risk with Tony Milando, the former Senior Vice President, Chief Supply Chain Officer of Xylem. So welcome, Tony.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So I just want to talk to you a little bit about different aspects based on your experience with Xylem and other places. The first question I have for you is, how did you deal with redundant production? How does your company, or how did Xylem and other companies that you worked for identify key products that require redundant production? And what factors do you think drove this decision?
Yeah, sure. I guess, we're in an industry, Xylem was in an industry geared towards having an operational network that was close to our customer that we served. Since there in our business, in that business, there were very few customers that were truly global, which means that, they were regional in most cases. And so our production network was regional. Meaning, that's not to say, and we didn't always achieve this, but most of the production, most of the revenue in any one region was served by a network of plants in that region or near that region. So very, very few of our factories actually shipped product around the world. That's not to say we were 100% dedicated regionally, but 80 or 90% of all of our sales in any one region was supported by that factory or factories in that region. And our biggest failure point is never really the facilities, the manufacturing facilities. It's always the supply base. In fact, I mean, if I were to rewind during the COVID period, roughly 50 of we had about 50 factories, and we only shut down 2 of those facilities for a combined total of about 15 days through the couple of year period of COVID. And that was, so that was we very rarely have an issue with our factories being impacted. It's always the suppliers. But in terms of our decision criteria for manufacturing similar product in 2 regions, there's really two criteria at the end of the day. One is, and we stratify our SKUs based on an ABC categorization, A being the highest revenue producing SKU, usually comprises about 20% of our SKUs, but 80% of our revenue. So any A or B SKU would be a candidate for redundant production. So that means it carries with it a lot of revenue. Typically, it's a high runner. And then secondly, if it had demand in multiple regions. And that's the other criteria is it being demanded in multiple regions? If it's not, that doesn't mean we wouldn't do it, but you start to lose scale, and obviously cost can be a little bit higher as you put in place redundant production.
So that leads me to the next question. So how did you weigh the associated cost and time investments for redundant production?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of considerations, for that. I mean, obviously, cost is one of the biggest challenges for redundant production, because redundant production is just that, right? It's production you put in place just in case, and it may not be fully optimized, meaning that if you didn't do it, your overall cost would be lower. And if you serve one region and you manufacture for that region, your manufacturing factory could be in or near the region. Then all your volume's flowing through that one facility, obviously. Once you add an additional facility, or you start to manufacture, you split the volumes, then you're sub-optimizing your cost, especially the non-variable cost or the fixed cost. That's why, as I mentioned earlier, the best candidates are the ones that have a lot of scale and where you possibly have demand in multiple regions. So, we definitely weigh cost in that. And in many cases, it's cost juxtaposed to potentially lost revenue if one of those facilities could go, gets impacted. And so we factor that in. That's a little bit of a softer factor as you weigh the decisions. The second challenge with setting up redundant production, though, is what I'd call design control. So in redundancy, you'll have multiple suppliers supplying the same or similar parts. And you need to make sure that they they meet, each supplier meets the appropriate drawings and the tolerances. And so that just requires extra work from your engineering team. Your design engineers need to have the ability to maintain both those designs. And when a design change occurs, and it could occur for a number of reasons, you may find you have a quality issue on a part, or you may find that you can get better costs by doing a value improvement project on a part. Whenever you do those things and you change the drawing or the design, you need to make sure that that change gets executed at both suppliers. And so this means time and qualification, and it means extra effort, extra effort from your design team. And that's also the case when you have multiple facilities and your assembling methods. Potentially you need to make sure that your assembling methods are yielding the same quality. They don't need to be the same. In fact, in many cases they aren't, because you may have one method that's more manual, say at a low cost location, and one method that might be more automated at a higher cost location. But as long as the quality and the reliability is the same, then you've been able to achieve that. Anytime you have two of anything, whether it's a supplier or manufacturing, keeping those in control so that the end product is the same and has the same performance characteristics, that's a challenge. Outside of the production facility, then making sure that, as I mentioned, weak link for us is always the supply base. Addressing those weak links are important. So eliminating the single and sole source suppliers is a big challenge. And probably the biggest rethink for us, and this has been around for years, this is nothing new, but probably the biggest rethink for us over the last few years is it's not good enough to dual source a part between different suppliers if they're in the same country. So this whole notion of geopolitical risk is something that's had increasing focus over the last several years.
That's great. Yeah. So it seems like there's a lot of focus in terms of reducing risk on supplier diversification. So what criteria do you use to select suppliers, or did you use, and how did you balance the sourcing from multiple countries or regions?
Yeah, so we developed a pretty mature strategic sourcing group, and they develop strategies for categories of parts and then for the parts themselves. And so first and foremost, if it's existing parts that we buy, I mean, we really want to make sure that we're leveraging suppliers that are part of that strategy. And so that's really important. And so a lot of the work has been done, but if it's new parts, right, beyond quality and capability, do they have the manufacturing capability to make what we need? Those are obviously criteria. We want to make sure they have a good BCP in place, which is a business continuity plan. So are they planning for the worst, right? Are they doing their scenario planning? Do they have cybersecurity in place? All the things that a good business continuity plan should have. We want to make sure our suppliers have that as well. We want to make sure that they have a continuous improvement program. So because we know we're all in a competitive environment and we want them to continue to get better, not only from a quality perspective, but from a cost performance perspective as well. We want to make sure they're financially viable. They got to have a sustainability program in place, so ethical manufacturing and sourcing, and they need to be socially responsible. And we also want to make sure that we're not creating a single or sole source situation, right? We don't want to be wed to one supplier if we don't have to be. Country sourcing, what country we source from is more or less a total cost of ownership model. So we obviously consider the piece price, logistics, riskiness of being in that particular region. Those are all things that are important. From a single and sole source perspective, and just to clarify, for us, single sourcing were parts that we only had one. We were buying from one supplier, but that we could buy from multiple suppliers. And sole sourcing was, we can only buy that part from that supplier because it's unique. It has intellectual property or something like that attached to it. And so we had a very rigid program around reducing the total number of suppliers that were in that category, either single or sole sourced. And we would prioritize those based on the revenue that those suppliers impact. So it wasn't necessarily, how much do we spend with the supplier? It's what revenue they impact on our sales. Because as you know, you could be buying a very small part that doesn't cost a lot, but you're single sourced, and if you don't have that one part, you can't make the product, right? And so we would quantify this group. We would prioritize what we would look at, and those plans would include making sure we qualify an alternative supplier, making sure that supplier doesn't have any liquidity issues. You know, if they are single or sole source, that our purchasing team had a good relationship and understood the dynamics of their business. We might stock additional inventory against those suppliers. And we would, in some cases, we may not qualify a second supplier, but we'd want to have the ability to move to another supplier in an acceptable period of time. So we might say, for this particular part, if we couldn't get supply, say, for a month or 2 or 3, that would be okay. And as long as we could get another supplier up and running within 3 months, then that would be acceptable to us. So those are the things that we would, look at when we talk about, how we select suppliers and using them for, what country we select them from.
That's great. I'm curious about your risk detection system. So, can you talk about how the risk detection and escalation system that you used was implemented in your supply chain?
Yeah, sure. Look, you can't eliminate risk, but you can take steps to mitigate it. And some of the ways that you mitigate it, we talked about redundant production and dual sourcing, ensuring that you have proper business continuity planning and your suppliers do, increasing inventory, or in the case of a risk detection system, enhancing the transparency in the supply chain. And we used a platform called Risk Methods. There's a number of platforms out there. We happen to like what they delivered. And when you look at a supply chain that's global and complicated, it's a big network, all attempting to work together. You can't be everywhere all the time. And so Risk Methods provided artificial intelligence platform that allowed us to see what was happening out there based on everything that was written in a large set of media, either just data sets or social media, whatever. So we mapped our entire supply base in terms of the locations of that supplier, their addresses, their sister facilities, our own factories. We added into this data set. We were mapping, when I left Xylem, tiers 2 through N, below that. And also we mapped some, our customers as well. So we mapped all of this in this system so that anytime there was any event at all, it could be a natural disaster, tsunami or tornado, whatever. You might remember the deep freeze that took place in Texas 4 years ago or so. Domestic unrest, when there was the march on Capitol Hill here in the US a couple of years ago. For instance, could be a change in the leadership of the company, maybe the CEO changes or the CFO changes, a merger, any financial distress. I mean, there's a series of risks. All this stuff is communicated in some way, shape, or form. And so this platform picks all that up, and it knows that it in some ways tied to a particular site that you've mapped. And so it basically provides, and by the way, every supplier or every potential risk that is highlighted will be assigned and is a map to a particular procurement person as well. So they'll get a list of these warnings every day. And I had a certain threshold based on my criteria where I would see them as well. So I would also get a list just so I knew if there was any pretty significant issues, some of our bigger suppliers, what was happening. But anyway, you get these notifications every day, and then you have to resolve them. And so you have to take some level of action. And it could be, hey, there's a CFO change. Yes, I knew that. I talked to the supplier. It's no big deal. I feel comfortable about that. So you've resolved that one. Or it could be, we have a deep freeze issue going on in Texas. Let's connect the dots. What can that impact? Oh, yeah, it ultimately will impact our molders in a completely different part of the country because they can't get resin that the refineries in Texas were providing to the resin manufacturers, right? So let me go out and buy some additional inventory now so it protects me when things go down. So that was the platform that we put in place. And it's had a lot of benefit to us being able just to have more visibility of what's going on around the world. And it provides the eyes and the analysis that we need to get started on particular issues that are happening.
And speaking of different risks that are out there and getting alerts about them, what about like geopolitical risk? I know that is, at the top of the list for a lot of supply chain managers. How did you assess and mitigate risk related to like trade policies or tariffs or other geopolitical risks?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, of course, we have a trade compliance group, and they stay current on developments around the world. And they have a lot of various means to do that. We have external trade experts as well that we work with. So there's a group that's looking at this, and that's their job, right? Make sure they understand what's going on. And depending on the size of the issue, it'll be handled at the appropriate level. So, a part of I mentioned BCP, business continuity planning. That's an enterprise exercise for our company. And these are basically, making sure we have all the right pieces in place, but also then on an annual basis doing what if analysis and an as needed basis what if analysis. So what happens to our business model when something like Brexit occurs? We had a lot of time to plan for that one. What happens to our business model when Russia invades the Ukraine? We didn't have a lot of time to plan for that one, right? Or tensions increase around Taiwan, or the Buy America, Build America plans from the Biden administration. All these things have implications on your business, number one, but also on your supply chain. And so, we have a group that's looking at trade compliance all the time, but we also do some planning for things that we think might happen. And then we get that same group together when things do happen. So that we have a plan around, what that means for the business, but as importantly, what does it mean for the supply chain? And so that's how we think about geopolitical risk. But as I mentioned, our strategy has always been what I call nearshoring. I mean, before people were calling it nearshoring, it was basically producing close to the market it serves, and that's what we've always strived for rather, is producing close to the market that we serve. Now we don't always get that 100% right, but that's really the momentum is doing that. We think there's a lot of benefit from that. One is usually in a similar time zone, so it makes communication easier. We think there's cost stability because if you're not in the same country, you're close to that country, and FX rates not always tend to work in tandem. So you don't have runaway inflation in a country that's halfway around the world. That you're dealing with a cost issue that's out of control because of FX rates. So we think it provides a better natural hedge, not always. And of course, logistics are shorter. So keeping things close to the market it serves has a lot of benefit for us. So, that's how we assess the risks and what we do about them. But we think that the underlying strategy of making close to the market provides a natural predisposition for less risk there. I will say that you know, like a real example of this was when President Trump put in place the tariffs on China exports into the U.S. Um, it was, you know, that was a pretty big impact to our cost structure, as it was for a lot of companies overnight. Obviously, no time to really plan for that, and we've all spent decades moving product to low-cost countries. And so we did a lot of the, you know, the calculus around it in terms of what it meant for our cost base, and we identified a handful of areas that we absolutely needed to kind of find alternative sources. And so we wound up in one case letting a large contract manufacturer in China know that we were going to move our product to another supplier, to otherwise the product wasn't going to be viable. They wound up working with us and moving and opening a facility in Vietnam. And so that allowed us to, you know, still take advantage of the lower cost profile, but not, you know, not have to, you know, be subject to the tariffs that came out at that time. So, you know, hopefully that gives you a sense for how we think about geopolitical risk.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. I think your expertise in these areas, especially supplier diversification and implementation of that risk detection system, I think, you know, that seems pretty useful, especially these days. And also, you know, the example that you just gave with the tariffs, I think that's good advice that other supply chain managers can use. So thank you so much for your expertise and your advice. We really appreciate your time today, Tony.
My pleasure. Thank you.